I am so excited to be here with you tonight. So excited to begin this this class. I've been sort of buzzing about it all day. Let's just begin, since we're starting this whole new series. Let's begin with a blessing just to sanctify this space. A blessing over Torah study, which ends with La'asok b'divrei Torah, so thanking God for allowing us to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. All right, let's get into this. So now this welcome to a biblical poetry series, and this class was inspired by a parsha class I did earlier in the summer on Parshat Hazinu, which is written in which is a poem, essentially. Parshat Hazinu is a poem that is recited by Moses at the end of the Torah. And in fact, God says to Moses, write down this poem or recite this poem. It's explicit. It's explicit except that, and here's the kind of the first thing that we'll learn, except that the word for poem in Hebrew is shirah. And what else does that word mean? I hear some of you mouthing it. Song. Right. So it also means song. So already when we head into the topic of biblical poetry, we are not sure if we're talking about the same thing that we are when we say poetry in English, because the word contains words that the English word doesn't always or necessarily contain. But I did this class on Parshat Hazinu, and people loved it. And it was such a good class, and actually people pressed for another one. Let's analyze, we talked about why the poem was there, but now let's analyze the poem. So we did a second class and people loved it again. And I just thought, oh, this is something people are thirsty for. This is something that people want to do, to analyze poetry, to read poetry is one of the great kind of human literary activities, but also sort of one of the great human enjoyments. And it turns out that our tradition has a lot to offer on that front. Half the tradition is poetry, or at least half of the Bible. You know, we often speak in Jewish learning about the difference in Jewish texts between law and narrative. Right? And in the Torah especially, we think, oh, these are the laws and this is the narrative. These are the commandments, these are the stories. Those are the two different genres. But the truth is, law itself is not such a major category of biblical writing. In the Torah, there's a lot of law, but after that, there really isn't much at all. And the truth is, it would be much more encompassing to speak of the split between prose and poetry in the Bible. That's the major split. Let me just show you how vast an area poetry covers in the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. And let's just take a look here at Sefaria. There's kind of an opening page here, and I just like, so the Tanakh stands for Torah, Nevi'im, prophets, and Ketuvim, writings. So there are three major sections. And just to go through the three sections here, so we will see tonight that the Torah is mostly prose, but has poetry or verse kind of like appears, and we'll have to contend with that. And then the prophets, the early books of the prophets are similar. These first, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, mostly just prose, storytelling. But then once we get to the book of Isaiah, maybe I'll even just click in here for a sec. The book of Isaiah is in verse form almost entirely. And the other major prophets here, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, mostly speak in verse form, though they go back and forth. And then, you know, look at all these are all books of poetry. All the prophetic books are books of poetry. And, you know, we might just stop there and spend an hour talking about why prophets speak in poetry. And what is the connection between prophecy and poetry? So let's keep that in mind. But but just to continue looking through the Tanakh here, we see that most of the middle section is poetry, or a good chunk of the middle section is poetry. And then once we get to the right, what's the most famous book of poetry in the Hebrew Bible? What was the book of poetry?
Song of Songs.
Oh, Song of Songs. I was thinking of the Psalms. The Psalms is like 150 poems, right? Straightforward poetry, but you're right. Maybe it isn't obvious because the last section of Tanakh starts with Psalms and then Proverbs, also in verse form, and then Job. The entire book of Job is kind of great theological exploration, mostly in verse form. The Song of Songs is the one that got a couple of votes just now, is a love poem, right? Or a sensual poem. The book of Ruth is not. The book of Ruth is prose, but Lamentations is, Ecclesiastes is, Esther is not, and the rest there are not. But you can see, I mean, entire books, and many of them, it feels like a good half of the Bible is poetry. And I have to say, one of the reasons that I'm doing this, I framed it as if I was like responding to, the will of the people. But the truth is, I feel understudied in biblical poetry. I feel like both the books themselves, like, have I really gone enough into the book of Isaiah or Jeremiah or Habakkuk? I'm not sure I've analyzed, and that's because this is a more difficult, I think, realm to access than the straightforward storytelling of the Torah, the prose of the Torah. Okay, so this is a big topic, and we're getting into it, and great. Let's go, except that we have a problem, which is that it's actually, though poetry, I just said, is dominating throughout the Hebrew Bible, it's actually hard to tell where the poetry is, because it's not the script of the scrolls that they wrote are generally not written in what we would think of as poetic form, with like distinct lines and separations. Now, I can make that point by showing you a section that is, and I did this when we studied Parshat Hazinu, but let's just start with the first major epic poem of the Torah, which is Shirat Hayam, the song at the sea, or the poem at the sea, right? We might say. Again, that word Shirah. But here's the page, just in the way that the Torah is written. Here's how the Torah is written, like as it would look on a scroll, and most of the Torah looks this way, and then a couple of places, suddenly you turn the page, and in Parshat Hazinu, it looks like this. Okay, so that's a poem, right? That at least somehow reminds me of what I think of as a poem, but that's not true for most of the Tanakh. It's not even true for the way that some of the scrolls that we think of as those are poems. Or someone shouted out Song of Songs. Song of Songs is not written out like a poem. And indeed, many of the poetic sections that we will analyze, some of them tonight, are not noticeable as a poem, though there is some reason to think that they are poems. And that's part of what we're going to try and figure out. And here, I'm just going to show you one more book here, but this is the JPS Hebrew English Tanakh. And you can just see, this is actually the poem we're going to look at tonight. You can see that they write mostly this like kind of block script, and they're down at the bottom of the page. Oh, wait, hold on. There, let's see if I can go even closer. You see right I've got the wrong, right there. They've indented. That might not be so clear, but you can see the indentation. Like, this is the poem we're going to look at tonight. There's one verse in Genesis 2 that the editors of this book decided to indent because they wanted to signal this is a poem. And what we're going to try and figure out is, how did they know that? Why do they think this is a poem? So let me ask you, let me just turn and ask you now, what's a poem? How do you know that something is a poem? Short of seeing it written out in poetic form, how do we know that we have come across, how do you think that the editors of the JPS Tanakh knew? And I want to ask you that question, but I'll ask it by sharing with you, first of all, a book that I'm going to rely on heavily, one of the sort of the classic of this topic, The Art of Biblical Poetry by Robert Alter. And here I'm going to chat you a quote I'm going to chat you the source sheet and then share with you a quote that Robert Alter uses. And I'm not sure, this is Robert Alter's answer to the how do we know. And he quotes yet someone else, and I'm not sure that we'll accept his definition, but here's what Robert Alter relies on. It's a quote from Barbara Herrnstein Smith from a book called Poetic Closure, The Study of How Poems End. And she says, as soon as we perceive that a verbal sequence has a sustained rhythm, that it's formally structured according to a continuously operating principle of organization, we know that we are in the presence of poetry and we respond to it accordingly. I don't know, a sustained rhythm, formally structured according to a continuously operating principle of organization. Does that sound right? How do you know that? What does it mean to speak in poetry or to write in poetry? Let's start with Florine. And just unmute yourself. Yeah, perfect.
As a writing teacher, I will tell you that part of that is true. Generally speaking, you'll find some kind of rhythm. It might be a rhythm that you're not accustomed to knowing as a rhythm. You might find metaphors. You find what I call soul speak, where some emotion is tapped into. That can be emotion from beauty, but it also can be an emotion from despondency, conflict.
Okay, I love that.
But the one thing that I disagree with in the definition that you just printed is that today a lot of poetry is not necessarily formally structured. We have what's called prose poetry, which goes in and out of prose into poetry, into prose, into poetry, or it's prose with poetic elements. So there's a little bit disagreement on that one's part of the definition.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Florine. And good to have an expert here. And I am not an expert. And I hope that this will be a kind of a symposium and people like Florine will help us kind of charge forward. Okay, so let's just take what Florine said. Rhythm. Okay, that does seem, there's something to that. The rhythm of there's some kind of rhythm that's meant or intended in the writing. And then Florine said in metaphor, the presence of metaphor and sort of other forms of linguistic creativity, right? Unique linguistic forms. And then Florine adds that a poem also can be distinguished by its emotive content, by its soul speak. Yeah. Okay, now that seems very true to me when I hear it, but also like that's a hard one to pin down, right? How do we know that we're in that realm, right? And as Florine is saying, it could be that something poetic doesn't obey some of the other, like doesn't have a metaphor, doesn't have a rhythm, but it seems to be a poem because of the way that it emotes. Okay, so there's something there too. All right, let's hear a couple of other opinions, other thoughts. Abby.
Well, I find in the Bible there's a lot of repetition, so it's almost parallelism. It's like this, and it's over and over. So to me, it's somewhat more poetic than just something that's not poetic, prose. I mean, it could be, doesn't have to rhyme. You know, obviously we don't know how it rhymes. I know some of them in the Bible are acrostics starting with certain letters and things like that, but there's a lot of parallelism.
Good, exactly right. That when we come to the Tanakh itself, I think it's fair to say there are many sort of poetic techniques, but Abby's exactly right. It's fair to say, and we'll soon encounter, that the hallmark, the kind of the device that biblical poetry is most known for is parallelism, meaning saying one thing and then saying something very similar right afterwards, as a way of saying the same thing. rhythmic quality even to that. And to that I will add that while on the one hand, the poems of the Bible are not always so clearly written out as poems, on the other hand, we have this tradition of cantillation, of like chanting the verses of the Torah that has a kind of a rhythmic structure implicit. And especially, I mean, there are certain, like there's a one of the ta'amim is an etnachta, a pause. And every verse has one, right? Somewhere in the middle, there's like a comma in the middle of every verse, which suggests that maybe there's like a parallelism to every verse in the Torah. Maybe the whole of the Tanakh is written in poetry. That would be an extreme version. And by the way, I have to just say, because this is so funny, not funny at all, actually, but just like the dry humor of Robert Alter. He says that at one end of the spectrum, the one that attempts to see the whole Bible as poetry, an Orientalist in the 1930s, Paul Krauss, set out to show that the entire Hebrew Bible, once properly accented, could be demonstrated to have been written in verse. When he discovered 2/3 of the way through his analysis that the text no longer bore out his thesis, he took his own life. That's not funny. But what is funny is that Robert also goes on to say, despite the grim fate of Paul Krauss, I don't think the attempt to describe the system of biblical poetry need be a suicidal enterprise. But anyway, so that's to say, there's a temptation. Paul Krauss had it, and anyone who chants the Torah has perhaps a temptation to see the whole thing as poetry. Okay, let's just take one more thought, and then we'll dive into actual poetry. Yael?
I was nodding furiously just now with his theory. I'm not that invested that I would harm myself if it didn't prove true. But I think when it's chanted, it gets in sync with our heartbeat. And that's not accidental. We get so linked to it that it becomes organic. And I think that in that way, it is poetic because poetry speaks to us on a level that is subconscious or superconscious. It's beyond and it's more vast. And I think that's what the cantillation, when it's bonded to the text, that's what happens to us. And we're moved.
Okay, wonderful. So Yael gives us both a what is poetry and also a what is poetry for. That is part of, as Yael sees it, part of what poetry is a kind of, as we've said, rhythmic, but syncing with the heartbeat, like something that gets inside of you and brings you into its rhythm. And here we must return to the first thing we said, which is that poetry and song use the same word in Hebrew. So we might ask, is every song a poem? Right? I played some rap at the outset. Surely rap begs that question. Is every rap song a poem? Right? But like, is poetry in some ways definitionally words that are set to music, rhythm, chant, some kind of pacing? Okay. And then we also got from Yael a kind of what is poetry for? Like, what is poetry meant to do? What is it meant to evoke in us? And that's one of the questions that I think we're going to be asking also as we move through, especially tonight, when we see these poems that are, we'll have time in this class to consider things like Shirat Hayam, where it's just a vast epic poem, or the book of Isaiah, which is like a vast epic poem. But what do we do when we just get like a poem that kind of comes out of nowhere at us? And what is it meant to do? Because those moments, more than any other, really beg the question, what is poetry for? Why does someone chant a poem? Okay, and let's get into it without further ado. We've got a lot of ado so far, but it's okay, it's the first class. Let's get into it and take a look at the first poem. And I must say, it's quite striking that the first poem, or at least the thing that commentators and analyzers have recognized as the first poem in the Tanakh, is in fact the first thing that a human being ever says out loud. that's already, I mean, we could just close up shop and go home, right? Like that's a remarkable thing. First time a human being opens its mouth, a poem comes out. And that's not true for the first thing that God says, right? So it's like something very human about poetry, right? If the first time that atom opens its mouth. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. And what we're gonna do is, first we're just gonna we're gonna deal with the same question we've been dealing with. How do we know that this is a poem? So first we're just gonna read the verse without trying to see its poetic form. And just from reading the verse, we're gonna try and figure out, well, what is poetical? Why is this one of the verses that, you know, the editors of the JPS said, oh, we're gonna indent this, okay? So you have the source sheet. Here, let me just chat it to you again. Okay, awesome. Let's take a look at it together. Okay, first let's just look at the verse, and then we're gonna look at it in context, and then we're gonna look at it basically 3 times in 3 different ways, okay? Or maybe I should chant it first. Should I chant it first? I think that's probably for the best, right? Vayomer Adam Zot Hapam Etzem Me'atzamai Uvasar Mibsari Lezot Yikarei Isha Ki Meish Luchazos. Okay, then the human said, this one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for from man was she taken. Okay, I want to just acknowledge, right, we're heading into gender stuff, and we live in an age where we're reconsidering all kinds of gender stuff, so we can keep that in the air, and also this is poetry, so I encourages us to look at it not as straight commentary on the genders and the gender roles, but as it's both of those things, and everything is allowed in this forum, but I want to at least acknowledge that. But let me ask you, what's poetic about this? Did you hear poetry just now? And why? Let me put it back on the, well, let me call on someone first, and then I'll put it back on the screen so we can look at it while we, what's poetic here? Do you see poetry? I'll read it one more time, and then we'll take analysis. Then the human said, Vayomer Adam, this one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for from man she was taken.
Yeah.
So I hear a little. Susan, is that you?
Oh yeah, it's the alliteration.
Okay.
Bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. It's rhythmic and it's repeating the word, and that is part of why it feels like poetry.
Beautiful. Great answer. The one that's really jumping out at us. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Alliteration, repetition. Other thoughts? Barbara. Hold on, I'm gonna unmute you. Can you unmute, Barbara? I'm asking to unmute, but that button never works. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So aside from that, what I'm hearing, because I'm listening to you chant it, and I don't understand the Hebrew, but I'm listening to you chant it. So for me, as a dancer, what I am hearing is the breath that comes deep, so internalized, deep within oneself, that comes out with its commas and its distance between words and parallelism, if you know that was said before, but we need that breath that goes down so deeply, and I hear that when you are chanting it, and to me that helps create the form, which is poetic.
Okay, I think that's a testament to the power of the cantillation, which again, but the cantillations themselves are not particularly unusual, right? I guess I could, in that, along those lines, any verse could be chanted and have that poetic rhythm. So yeah, let's keep going. Dana, what do you think?
I think even just looking in the context of it, so rhythm and how it's written aside, the context wasn't God looking to create a companion for man? Isn't where, and God created animals first, and then when woman was created, maybe this is where Adam felt this is it. This is my companion. This is who can be with me, that kind of thing. So more in a contextual way, I'm seeing it as poetry.
Okay, wait, I want to come back to you, Dana, because you've said, most of the time, this is so kind of you, because most of the time I'm like struggling to get as many comments in as I can, but then like worried that I'm not going to get to the next text, but you sort of pushing us to the next text, because this is the next thing I want to do, is to see, okay, that was the poem, starting this one at last, until was she taken. But Dana's,
Rabbi,
can't really understand that without looking at the fuller context, and she's right. So let's take a look at how that comes out, because maybe this will help us to understand, and I want to hear from you again, Dana, why, given the context, this feels like a poetic exclamation.
Rabbi, can I just ask, is woman the same construction in Hebrew, that it's the word man with something added to it?
Yeah, and it's interesting. It is, and that's. Do you want? And why are you asking that question? Do you want to like comment on that? Or
I was just, because there's a poetry in that in English, at least. I'm wondering if it's the same in the Hebrew.
Correct. Yes, that's right, Jacob. There's something poetic about what Adam, Ha'adam, is doing here, right? We're going to call this one Isha because she was taken from Ish. And that word, Ish, man, is not a word we've actually seen used so far. Like, Adam doesn't invent the word woman. Adam invents the word man in order to define this thing that Adam is describing. Because so far, Adam has just been described as Ha'adam, the person. And let's see, we can actually see that in the longer passage here. So let's take a look. It's a very good question, because there's some kind of deliberate wordplay that Ha'adam is doing here, right? Lezot yikare isha ki me ish lukhazot. This one shall be called woman, for from man she was taken. Okay, here's the context. The eternal God said, I spoke on this actually on Rosh Hashanah, this verse, it is not good for the human to be alone. I will make a fitting helper for him. Okay, now that's interesting, and Dana referenced this phrase right here, Ezer Kenegdo. That's a famous phrase, and it's a phrase which has two parts to it. Ezer, which is like a kind of a help, a support, and then Kenegdo, which is a kind of like up against, or like parallel to. And the rabbinic tradition has actually read that to mean like this companion is going to have ways that she assists and ways that she challenges, and that there's a dynamic tension there. But okay, that's the phrase, Ezer Kenegdo. I'm going to make how's the fitting helper for him. The fit is the Kenegdo. That's how they're translating that. And the eternal God, okay, so there's going to be a helper or a companion or something. It's not good for a person to be alone, and so going to have to make. And it seems like here comes Eve, right? But no. Instead, the eternal God then does a strange thing. Formed out of the earth all the wild beasts and all the birds of the sky, and brought them to the human to see what he would call them. And whatever, I tried to change all these, but this is not right. It's not whatever the man, it's Ha'adam. Whatever the human, or I should even say person, so it doesn't even have like the man form in it, because it's a different word, Ha'adam. Whatever the person called each living creature, that would be its name. And the person gave names to all the cattle and to the birds of the sky and to all the wild beasts. But for the Adam, this is a little confusing because now I've translated it 3 different ways, but it's been Adam every time. For Adam, no fitting helper was found. No, and that same language again, no, lo matzah ezer kenegdo. It's a little strange. Like, It's just the narrative of it is a little strange. Oh, it's not good for a person to be alone. I'm going to create all these animals, and none of them was the Ezer Kenegdo. So then the eternal God cast a deep sleep upon the human, and while he slept, God took from one of his sides and closed up the flesh at that spot. This word for sides does also mean ribs, but I think that the correct translation is side, both because of the context and because that's the way rabbinic tradition has understood it. Not like a bone was taken out, but it does have that, it has both of those valences, which for our purposes, right, there's like feminist implications for which reading you choose, but for our purposes, both of those are actually useful because of the later reference to bone. Okay, so God took from one of his sides and closed up the flesh at that spot, and the eternal God fashioned the side that God had taken from the human into a woman. And given Jacob's astute question here, all of this human stuff is confusing because it should be the person into a woman. This is the first time the word woman is used, and the word man has never been used. Okay, so as the Torah, the text of the Torah goes, and I think this is an important point, you know, with one eye to sort of feminist reading, woman, the word woman is not actually based on the word man. The two sort of appear, and in fact, the word woman appears first. They appear as cognates of one another. And God brought her to the human. And then the human said, this one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for from man she was taken. And then finally, it's worth mentioning, that is why, hence, a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife so that they become one flesh. It's like, and that line like influences the reading that it's two sides which become one again. But okay, there's the fuller context. It's weird. It's really weird. Like, what is the person doing there? What's the person up to? Let me circle back to Dana here. What do you, given the context that you kind of helped us remember, why then, given that context, does the person suddenly exclaim in poetry?
Because it's not just, oh, there's a giraffe, there's a dog, this is my counterpart, this is part of me. Adam is not just saying, yep, that's part of my bones of my bones. It's just, it adds a beauty to it. Good,
beautiful. And this reminds me of what Florine said at the outspeak. There's some soul speak here. There's some sort of a motive, like Adam isn't just saying, oh, I'll name another one, but this time it's, you know, dun 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 dun, I found a companion. Like there's something declared, like he gets up on the rock, you can imagine, and starts reciting, I found her, you know, like that's right. So there's something like that going on here. Let's see, Marlene.
So I think these words at last are very emotive. So it's not just that here's this one, but at last. So we've gone through the animals, we've gone through all of this, and at last I have this companion, and there's something quite moving about that.
Yeah. Good. We're gonna have occasion to reconsider the translation here, which the JPS gave us, which is this one at last. But they're playing on some real, something real in the Hebrew, which is zotapam. This is the time. It's hard to translate that. This time, some people say this time is right. It's a little hard to translate, but they've translated it this one at last. And Marlene is saying, there it is. That's the declaration. That's the great sort of, behold, I now speak to you. This is the one. Like there's something very, very, you're to be alerted to the words I'm about to say now.
Rabbi,
yeah.
I have a question. When it says zotapam, is that an intimation about Lilith? Hapam.
Oh, it's a great
because
question. Yeah, it's not well,
it means
depends.
this
there
time.
There is a Midrashic tradition that says, right, we have to figure out, and that's part of what we're doing, reading this poem, is what does he mean this time? So one of the ways that the Midrash picks up, and the Midrash is like rabbinic tradition of interpretation, and I must say, the composers of Midrash were incredibly sensitive to language. They had poetic ears. Right? They're always noticing little nuances. But yes, one of the Midrashic spins on this is like, this time? What do you mean this time? Like, where was the other time? Now you could read it in its context, but they're like, oh, there must have been another woman. you know. And then comes the story of Lilith, who was the woman who was, you know, maybe you've heard the story, but like more dominant and powerful. And I think the Midrash even says that she was on top when they were, you know, in coitus, and she was like, and that was somehow not good. She was, you know, too powerful, and so she was cast out. Maybe she even had a demonic quality. She was cast out. And, you know, speaking of feminist readings, right, there's an entire journal called Lilith, which is a way of reclaiming like that woman who was powerful and was kicked out, right? So that's a good way of like really, you know, riffing on the Zota. But what does it mean this time? This time. Okay, but we'll leave that aside for now. That's a midrashic strain. We're going to focus on just the words themselves. But let's hear from a couple more people, and then we'll move forward into the poetic structure itself. Esra.
Oh yes, two things that came to mind. One was, I think, along the lines of what Marlene was saying, that the Zot Hapam. I just wanted to point out how Zot, just listening to the Hebrew again, the music of it, that phrase comes up a few times, and there's like a playfulness there, like Zot Hapam Matzam Miatzmai Basar Mibasrai Lezot, and then it ends with Lukachat Zot. So there's a lot of like playfulness there, just hearing it. It's so much more poetic in the Hebrew, I think, than the English translation, just listening to it. And then also, I think I came to another aha moment. I don't know if we talked about this, like what makes poetry poetry, but the that room for reading things in more than one way. You know, that Adam could be a they, maybe, or you know, person. And I just, anyways, I was thinking about how what makes something poetry is the ability to read it in more than one way.
Okay, I love both of the things that you said. That there's a kind of, right, we noted that Jacob noted this before, there's a kind of like, there's a person, and now there's a man and a woman part of the person, and in the naming of the woman, the man is somehow like defining himself, naming himself, which is a play on the fact that they were, before this, they were like, there's a sort of like playing with language in order to express new ideas that feels very poetic. And what Esther says about the repetition, not just of flesh, flesh, and blood, blood, but this is like very well noticed. And now I think it's worth heading into the poetic structure here. I've tried to, like, we saw it indented in the JPS. I tried to do some job of that myself. So let's just take a look at how it might look if it were written as a poem. And I changed one thing in the translation, and it completely tracks with where Esra was going, which is that instead of this one at last, I wanted to emphasize exactly what Esra wanted to emphasize, that there's a zot here, right? And there's a zot at the end, and there's a zot here. Now, zot means this one, but this, right? But it's a feminine this one, right? So it refers to this, to her. And so I translated it as, and instead breaking up the words as this one, this time, is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for from man this one was taken, right? And Esther's of course right that, you know, you never get the fullness of it in translate. Poetry is like a crazy thing to even try to translate, but you heard it even in the English there. If you keep the this one, you can hear that that's repeated as well. And what does that mean? That means that there's something about this poem that's like her, she's the one, she's the one, she's the one. There's something in that there as well. Okay.
Oh, and can I just really quickly, just to add a little more play, it reminded me of one of those rap songs. I forget which classic one, but like the rapper's like this Anna, like that Anna,
right,
there's this Anna, that Anna. So anyway, I just wanted to rope that in too.
No, but that's very good, because it's playing with the rhythm of even this and that. You can get with this, or you can get with that. You can get with this, or you can get with that, right? Like there's something to, like, once you have these sort of the binaries that exist in language itself, then it's sort of like, and like this, and like this, and like this. And as Abby said at the outset, this is a poetic tradition that is not entirely, but largely defined by parallelism. So the kind of like this and that, man and woman, bone, bone, flesh, flesh, like all of that is very distinctively, you can start to get a sense of why they did the indentations here. Okay, Emil, what do you think?
I was going to say, you know, when I think of poetry, I think of like language that makes things strange, you know, like that was, I think, like a Russian idea of like you feel the stoniness of the stone, you know, or you see things with fresh eyes. And this is like very mysterious. And it's like you say, like it promises one thing and then it suddenly goes into another thing, which is, can be funny, can be suspenseful, you know, and then it sort of rounds back to what was promised in the first place. And there's a kind yeah, like you could say that's playful. I think Nabokov echoes some of this language in Lolita, you know, like I know Lolita, but like, you know, but like it's playful, but it's also it's like unnerving, you know, like because it has this mix of like authority and vagueness and then specificity and then back to vagueness again. So it keeps you, you know, you're on the hook basically. Like you want to see how it ends.
Ooh, I love that. I love that. Right? I just love that. Because like, just like, right, Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul. So beautiful, talking about pedophilia, right? And here too, there's something like, oh, this one's bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. Well, that's pretty straightforward. Wasn't she just taken out of his bone and flesh? But there's something deep going, like, this one is my flesh and bone. Like there's something, I'm defined by, like there's something really strange and haunting and dizzying and cool going on here, even as he's saying very kind of straightforward things. I want to just, I'm going to keep taking comments, but I want to just also ask, you know, does this, I mean, it's not really a fair question because I just copied the JTS, but like, does this feel like the right way to write it out as a poem? Right? Like, I want to throw that question into the mix because after all, this is just a choice on how to break it up. That wasn't done by the scribe. So like this part here presumably is not a part of the poem, right? As they've understood it. And then, as Esra pointed out, it begins with the zot. Zot tapam, etzem matzamai, uvasar mibsari, lezot yikarei isha, ki meish lukhat zot. So that's a structure I'm offering here. I don't know. But okay, let's continue to take thoughts and analysis. Hannah?
Yeah, well, first, this isn't my comment, but to address your question, I think that is exactly how it would be because that's what the trope tells you. If you look at the cantillation of it, I don't think it's just Rabbi David Kasher says. I think that's what the trope also says, which is that's how, if you know trope, you break up the phrases in a certain way, and this is how those phrases get broken up because each of those phrases, as you've written it out, ends with a pausal trope of some kind. It ends with what you would consider a phrase or a family of trope. So I think that's exactly how it would be written. That's not my comment, though.
Okay, let me just, like, because you've said a very important thing, and Hannah is the one to say it because she's an excellent laner. I said earlier that there's always a symbol in the middle that breaks up the verse. That's this symbol right here. Can you see my arrow or no? Yeah. That's the etnachta. But Hannah is saying, knowing a lot about the trope, that there are trope units and this are connected. And there's a kind of a pause. This and this are connected and there's a kind of a pause, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of takes us back to one of the first things we were thinking about, which is that maybe the whole Torah is a poem. And I must say, by the way, that when God tells Moses to write down this poem in Hazinu, that will be a testament to the generations. Many of the commentators, there's a strain of rabbinic teaching that's like, no, God doesn't mean the poem Hazinu. God means the whole Torah, because the whole Torah is a poem. So that idea goes all the way back. All right, back to Hannah. What was your?
Oh, no, all good. I was just going to say that the other thing that keeps coming up for me is that this is such a visceral experience that he's having that it feels like that is part of why it has to be poetry, that so much of the rest of the experience of the person at this point is intellectual in some way. It's just kind of an observation. Okay, this thing is happening. Okay, there's this animal. Okay, I'm giving it this name. Okay, I'm seeing this thing. I'm doing this thing. But this is really the first time that there's this experience that's in their body in a way that they don't actually have words for as much as feeling or experience. And that's so much the experience of poetry also, that it's trying to articulate some kind of more intense feeling or kind of ethereal experience or something that isn't very easy to pin down. It's not just like there's a cat, there's a dog, there's whatever. It's like, how do I try to articulate to you how much this has transformed me? How can I use words to express this thing that's completely inconceivable that's happening in my body and in my mind and my soul? And so I think in that way also it has to be poetry, and it has to be different from what else, the other stuff we've seen.
Great. So beautifully put, Hannah. Thank you for that. And I think that, yeah, I mean, what are the things that we're trying to express that are difficult to express here? Love, sex, intimacy, companionship, finding your one, finding the person that you will be united to, and like all of those things are suddenly swirling around for a person who was so far just like, who said before, giraffe, cow, right? Like it's something. And so when, you know, as Hannah's describing this, it makes sense for me of the last line in that passage, right? There's this poem here, and then this strange thing is said, and therefore a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife so that they become one flesh. Like, what? I mean, on the one hand, I guess it's a euphemism, it's for sex, but like this verse is saying something so much deeper. And following Hannah's analysis, it's as if the poem has kind of unlocked the almost mystical possibilities of what it is to find someone and be intertwined with them. Okay, let me take one more comment on this poem, and then before we close, I want to just reference another poem that comes early on that'll give us a kind of a path into the future. But Kathy.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm just so struck with the fact that the word for woman comes before the word for man, and that it was before it was Adam, you know, the person, and you know, it you know, the sort of structure of it in terms of is kind of nice, but it's also, I mean, that this is all in the context of words being creation, you know, in other words, things being created through words, that God does that. And then Adam kind of does that because he names all of these animals. And so he's naming, and so that he really, in naming the woman first, it's like she's created first. And then he's kind of, in a sense, derivative. Or, I mean, you know, we've always heard the story as woman being derivative of man, because it's like, oh, pulling out the rib. But in fact, if the naming is really the critical part, you know, she comes first. Of course, he's choosing the name, but do you know what I mean? But there is a kind of more of a mutuality than I had ever really read into this verse.
Good. Wow. Okay. Not surprisingly, Kathy said a lot of insightful and beautiful things. But let me just say some of them in a simple way, which is that, yeah, I mean, the biggest thing Kathy said, which is that this is a story about a world created through speech. That's the core theology, right? And now suddenly God turns to the human and says, you start naming things, right? Ulechoshech karalayla, God named things. Now you start naming things. But at first it's like, okay, cow, giraffe. And then all of a sudden, the person is like, whoa, this is something else. And I'll name it, but in naming it, I also name myself. I create myself through recognizing the other. I understand who I am. Right? God hasn't even told me who I am. God never said, you're a man. It's just that he understands, like, wow, this thing comes from me and is the other half of me. Right? That's quite something. Self-creation. Right? Yeah. Okay. Okay. We're almost out of time. We're going to try to keep to mostly an hour. We'll probably bleed over sometimes, but I think tonight we can do it. I want to we've done some good work at analyzing this poem, and I want most of our time to be that, just sort of analyzing poetry together as a group. But I am going to try and give us a little bit of a kind of overview or, context. How do we understand poetry as it appears throughout the Torah? And I want to do something here that I think will help us move forward, which is to mention another poem, again, another kind of indentation in the, that you find in the book of not just in the book of Genesis, but in Parshat Bereshit. And it's actually this poem that we analyzed. I love what we did, and I'm happy we picked it. But the poem that actually Robert Alter starts with is one that comes a couple of chapters later, and is in my mind a less exciting poem. But I just want to show you something that happens in that poem, and in order to do so, we need to just take a little bit of a running start here. In order to do so, this poem is going to be spoken by one of the descendants of Cain, and it'll reference something that happens to Cain. So what happens to Cain is that after Cain kills Abel, God banishes Cain to wander forever. And then Cain says, oh, it's too much. I can't possibly, my punishment's too great to bear. People are going to try and kill me for what I've done. And God says, I promise if anyone kills Cain, 7-fold vengeance shall be taken on him. Kol hareg Cain, shivatayim yukam, right? And the Eternal put a mark on Cain, lest anyone who met him should kill him. Okay, that's important because the poem that Robert Alter spends a lot of time with, and that is spoken by one of Cain's great-great-grandson, one of Cain's descendants, Lemech, is a weird one. Lemech says to his wives, and again, I don't think this is part of the poem. This is where the poem starts. He has 2 wives, and he says, and here the parallel, here maybe the reason Robert Alter picked this one is because the parallelism is really striking. But Ada and Sila, hear my voice. O wives of Lamech, give ear to my speech. I have slain a man for wounding me, and a lad for bruising me. If Cain will be avenged 7-fold, then Lamech 77-fold. Okay? So that's the poem, and it's interesting. I read the first chapter of this book if you want a thorough analysis of it. I mean, there's clearly parallel. I've slain a man for wounding me and a lad for bruising me, and there's a kind of much more even than what you just had. There's real parallelism there. It's worth thinking about. We'll think about parallelism more in subsequent classes, but I just want to, in our last few minutes, point out that something really interesting happens here in this poem that will stamp biblical poetry for the rest of the Tanakh. And that is that here Lamech uses, in part of his parallelism, as he declares his poem, right? Like Adam said, Zotapam, this one, this time. What Lamech says is, Ada and Sila, hear my voice, Shaman Koli, O wives of Lamech, give ear to my speech. Nishe Lamech, Hazena Imrati. Okay, 2 different ways of saying listen, which, okay, big deal. That's the way parallelism works. We're seeing how it works. But just pay attention to these verbs, because what ends up happening, and maybe you can already hear it because I told you this whole class started out of an analysis of Parshat Hazinu. Hazinu, which is written in the form of a poem. Hazinu, which means give ear, which is related to this verb form here. And just pay attention to this couplet here, because they go on to introduce the poem in Hazinu. Give ear, O heavens, let me speak. Hazinu hashamayim v'adabeira. Let the earth hear the words I utter. Okay, so that's a nice, Moses is picking up on an earlier tradition, but not just Moses. Balak, the foreign prophet, also says, Ushma v'hazina Adai b'no Tzipor. Listen and give ear to me, son of Tzipor. And then we see that with Deborah's poem in the book of Judges. Shim'u malachim, hazinu roznim. Hear, O kings, give ear, O potentates. Isaiah, shimu shamayim v'hazinu eretz. Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth. The book of Job. Listen to my words. Oh, I should translate this as here. Listen, hear my words, give ear to what I say. In other words, that's just a very quick tour, but you can see, wow, there's something that gets started at the almost the origins of biblical poetry that gets repeated. and repeated and echoed throughout history, which is to say, and I want to just sort of close on this thought, that there is a poetic tradition in this book, right? It isn't just that there is poetry in this book. There are certain forms and styles and reference points, and the poems begin speaking to each other. And that's also part of what we want to keep in mind, take account of as we move through this, okay? So we're at 7. I'll stick around for another few minutes for questions, but I am excited to begin this journey with you for my own edification. And I have a lot to learn from you. They're real experts, like people who teach this stuff in universities for a living that are here with us tonight. So I hope that they will help lead our way. I'll do my best to do my part, and we'll all, like, this is a space for us all to offer to do poetry, not just to learn about poetry. Okay. So that's the class for tonight. Any questions? Matt. I can't hear you.
There I am. Okay, I'm unmuted. That thing about hear and give ear, because when we started off about poetry, there's something about the physicality of poetry. It's the sound, not just what you can translate. It's not just the meaning, but it's the physicality, the sound, that rhythm. And it seems to be acknowledging that it's both the meaning of the word and the physicality of what I'm doing are important here.
I love that. I love that. Love that. Love that. And it echoes an earlier comment that poetry has to, there's something about it has to like get inside of us. It has to somehow like enter us. And that, so that I like put your ear here and I'm going to speak a poem into your ear, right? Like, okay, great. Love that. Other thoughts, questions, comments? Alexandra.
Is it for sure that Adam actually fulfilled his task in naming the animals? Because I was looking at the tenses and I didn't see it on the screen long enough, but it seemed like he would do it, but it didn't say specifically to my eye going back that he definitely did do it. So I'm just wondering if
the human gave names to all the cattle and to the birds of the sky and to all
okay, never mind. Never mind. Okay, thank you.
No, it's a wild passage, a little hard to understand because it's not clear why God's offering that responsibility to him at all. And I will just, now that we're after hours, I'll just share with you we already talked about Lilith, right? So we've gone blue here. The Rashi here brings a piece of Talmud that says that, remember, God's like, I want to find an Ezer Kenegdo, and Adam didn't find an Ezer Kenegdo. Like, what happens? I want to find a companion, name all these animals. He didn't find a companion among the animals. Like, what's going on? And the Talmud says the obvious thing that a dirty mind would think, which is that Adam was sleeping with all of these animals, and then finally was like, oh, that works. This is right. So okay, right? Like it's after hours, right? But that tells you that there's something confusing going. Like, what is? And this picks up on Kathy's comments. That, like, there's something that's happening in naming that is profound, right? Like, what is going on in the naming, and why is Adam doing it for these animals and then suddenly doing it for his partner? Marlene.
So I'm interested in this question of the repetitiveness of hear me, listen, give ear to this, because it seems to me that it's kind of a heads up, like this is really important, or this is poetry. And so I'm wondering if this is meant to be more important than other passages in the Torah that are equally important in terms of how they affect us or how we respond to them or what we're meant to do because of them. So I'm just wondering what the import is of this repetition of give ear. Is it just, aha, it's a poem, or emotionally get ready for something that's much more intense than what we've been doing before, or all of the above?
It's a really good question. I certainly can't answer it fully, but I will say you're making a point that I failed to make, and it's important. It's not just that there's a poetic tradition or style being established, but that's a code. And a lot of the poems have a kind of a code, like, hey, wake up, everybody. I'm about to recite a poem. It's time. Gather round, gather round. And some of them are not surprising. Many of the things that are in verse form in the Tanakh are blessings, prayers, Hannah's prayer, right? Things that are recited, things that are a big declaration. So yes, this sort of listen, give ear is like, it's almost, you can imagine the bard sort of standing up on the podium and saying, hear ye, I am about to recite a poem. And I think that is part of what that means, and about the function of these words, and whether verse in general is meant to be taken more seriously or differently than something else. That is a great question, which we will continue to explore as we go. Let's see, anyone not get a chance to speak that has a hand up? Barbara.
Yeah, I just want to say something about the power of repetition and how I find it so exciting that you brought up Nabokov, because that opening of that novel, I feel, is one of the strongest, most powerful openings of any novel that I have read. And he's doing the same thing as I hear that you have mentioned here, with the repetition of Lolita and Lolo, and he plays on that word all along, and it just pulls you right into the text.
Yeah. So true. And thank you to Emil for bringing Vladimir Nabokov into the mix. One of the great writers in the English language, who did not grow up with English as his mother tongue. And Nabokov, I think, once said, yeah, the story is about a creepy guy who is in love with a little girl, but the work, Lolita, is about my love affair with the English language, right? And you could really see that. I mean, it's, yeah, but all of the strangeness, that Emil brought up is more than present there, and certainly also more than present in the Hebrew Bible. It's a book which is like bizarre and mysterious and strange, and that's, I think, that's part of what this, Emil said this very well, part of what this poetry might be trying to communicate or convey, or as Hannah said, sort of like to allow for a kind of opening into this almost sort of mystical space. Okay, one last comment, Isra. Oh, wait. Two last comments, because I want to hear, finally, we'll close with Florine, who started us off. Isra, please.
That seems poetically accurate. Anyhow, I just wanted to bring God into the relationship in a way, because I was coming into a felt sense of back when I used to write poetry, which I don't, sadly, as much. And there's something about, like, we talk about the muse, like it comes, of course, a mentor once told me, you don't wait for the muse, you have to invoke the muse. But there's something about, like, maybe Torah is all one poem, but then there's poetry within the poetry, right? Like these moments of the declaration and standing on the, And so it's almost like when Adam says what Adam says, because they had a moment of divine inspiration. They did their naming, and they could only go so far, and there was no helper, kenegdo. And only through divine inspiration did something happen that then facilitated this, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And so maybe poetry also, I don't know, sometimes like something will come out when I've written in the past. I'm like, where did that come from? It comes from something unknowable that one could say is divine, perhaps. I don't know. So.
Beautiful. And what you've done is given us a first answer at a question we just suggested at the outset, which is, what is the relationship between prophecy and poetry? And why is it that our great prophets, the ones we record, all are recorded in verse? And you're saying something quite spectacular, which is that the prophets who are, ostensibly speaking with the Ruach HaKodesh, the Spirit has come upon them. So when the Spirit of God comes upon you, like, what comes out of your mouth? It's not just words. It's like words, music, rhythm. Like there's something more than just speaking that's happening all of a sudden. And you are, as the prophets, are doing explicitly, perhaps channeling something. Right? Okay. Florine, will you close us out tonight?
I hope I can do it right. A sign of a very effective writer is to go beyond objectification, which is names, and to go into writing in a way that develops relationships. And that relationship can be time relationship. When you did Zot twice, that's developing a relationship with time. someone else mentioned the relationship with our body, movement. It could be a relationship of person to person, or it could be a relationship to God, to Hashem. And so I think that what you did tonight was you opened up that whole world of using poetic form to develop relationships on multiple levels. I congratulate you. This was just great. Absolutely great.
Thank you so much. Well, great. May this experience bond us all together in relationship. And here we go. See you next week. Bye, everyone.
Great.